Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree. I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
A community off northern Vancouver Island is at the center of an eerie mystery. People in Alert Bay say they've been hearing strange screams and howls from the forest at night, and the legend of the Sasquatch runs deep in their First Nations culture. As CTV's Gord Kurbis reports, some are now wondering if those legends are real. We heard it once, and I didn't get the recording, and then second time I got the recording. And that's it was on the back porch. Very eerie. The audio was recorded just recently on the backside of Cormorant Island. It's been heard by many all over the island.
This summer, I've heard it 3 times. I've heard it scream 3 times. But it's been coming here for years.
Whatever's been making the noise is heard primarily at night. Some say it's a dog, but others say that's impossible. John Bindernagel makes his way into a forested area on Cormorant Island, looking for a creature many say doesn't exist.
It comes back to this question that comes up in other places. Not why is it here, how could it be here, but there is evidence that it is here.
The wildlife biologist is one of North America's best-known Sasquatch researchers. He's here because many on the island in the community of Alert Bay are seeing and hearing something they can't explain.
Vocalizations which we really can't attribute to wolves, coyotes, loons, owls. So it's in that area of possible Sasquatch.
While the howls and screams that have been heard throughout Alert Bay could be dismissed as simply animal noises, you have to keep in mind that Cormorant Island is a location where there is no wildlife. There's no bears, no cougars, not even any deer. And while you could dismiss the noises, there have been plenty of sightings.
One person that's seen it, her father lives in Alert Bay, and she came up to visit her father. So she went up to the graveyard to pay respects to one of her family. And when she went up to the graveyard, she seen it standing there. She turned around and she got out of there right away. She didn't even go to the graveyard.
And a more recent sighting when a group of teens were playing soccer near the band's big house. A large upright creature moved quickly alongside the building in just a few strides. Yeah, they took off right away. They don't even stay there anymore after the dark.
But the thing that's happening now is when the dogs start answering it, and it quits.
I think it's more conceivable than people think, and more conceivable than I used to think, that a Sasquatch could be here, could only be being observed once every several years, a fleeting glimpse, but which is leaving, well, I'm calling it a record of its presence.
That record, Bindernagel says, includes large footprints that have sometimes been photographed in different locations around the island. The creature has also been acknowledged in the First Nations culture for years as Zunakwas. He knows there are many skeptics, but he's confident one day the mystery will be solved. Gord Kurbis, CTV News, Alert Bay.
Now, we only have these still pictures for you. Japanese scientists spotted it about 9 miles east of Chichi Island in the northern Pacific. They say it's up to 26 feet long. Look at that, which is the length of 4 Kobe Bryants, or most.
Over hundreds of years, the giant squid has been said to exist by the men of the sea. At first, the mainstream scientific community attacked the notion as a manifestation by the paranoid mind, a monster. However, today we know this creature to exist because the mainstream scientific community found corroborated trace evidence in Wales. The Sasquatch has been said to exist for over hundreds of years by early native Canadian tribes. This has been corroborated by thousands of eyewitness accounts by people across North America. And trace evidence has often been plentiful. But why? Why does the mainstream scientific community still not acknowledge the existence of this creature?
This is actually modeled after a jaw, a fossil that consists of only the body of the mandible and the teeth that it contained, of Gigantopithecus blacki. This is a inferred reconstruction of Gigantopithecus, but Gigantopithecus has long been considered a sort of a potential ancestor for Sasquatch. In short, it's the right size in the right place at the right time to potentially have expanded its range from Eastern Asia into North America and may be, in fact, ancestral to Sasquatch. Its cranial proportions actually are remarkably similar to those seen on the Patterson-Gimlin film subject, which provides us a very convincing and compelling piece of photographic evidence.
For thousands of years, people from all around the world have heard tales of encounters with relic hominids. In other words, people have been stating that they have come across ape-like men long forgotten or thought to have been extinct in the deep wilderness. In North America, the most commonly known relic hominid is named Sasquatch, or Bigfoot.
Well, in the mid-1930s, a jawbone was found in a cave in China. And an anthropologist looked at that and he says, this is a jawbone of an ape, a gorilla, but very large. And because of the way the jaw was spread, he said it also sets on a spine, meaning it walked upright. It wasn't a quadruped. They estimated that it probably would have been around 8 to 10 feet tall. They had teeth, had some of the teeth still in the lower jawbone. They found teeth over in China in the shops. They were grinding them up, these fossilized teeth, using them for medicine. Very interesting, because our continent was connected with China at one time. That was the only one at the time. Since then, 4 more jawbones have been found between Vietnam, India, and China. So these things were spread out over a long distance. And the first one, I think they dated back 500,000 years. Must have went extinct 500,000 years ago. The next one was like 300,000 and 200,000 and down to 100,000. Every time they find a newer one, okay, it went extinct then. John Green once said, you should, of all the things people describe, they have an amazing similarity in their description of what they're seeing, what they could make up and what they're seeing. And they describe this upright, large, bipedal ape.
There was a huge higher primate.
Is that the Gigantopithecus?
Yeah. Got 3 or 4 jawbones, hundreds of teeth in China. Lived till, let's say, about 100,000 years ago, more or less. There's nothing to say it isn't still alive today.
So now we don't have to make up a creature to fit it. We had one that we thought was extinct. Hair samples have been found, they've been turned in, they call them an unclassified primate. They don't really have anything to match them to. Well, about a year or so ago, DNA has finally gotten to the point they've been able to extract DNA from a fossil.
This is all hair, that's hair, now. Can we take this and get it analyzed? You betcha.
So we had the stuff analyzed. A New York City laboratory said it was just like human hair. But that doesn't necessarily prove it didn't come from Bigfoot, a human-like creature.
It's got to get recognized eventually. You know, from DNA. Now they're getting DNA from teeth that we would have considered would just be stone. So since this is possible, why on earth aren't they studying this?
Now, because we have hair samples that have been called unknown primates, there's no classification to put them to. I am hoping they will be able to get some of these teeth, because now over 4,000 teeth since the early finding of the first jawbone have been collected. And I'm hoping that one of them will be early enough to our time that they'll be able to get DNA from it. If they do, and they could match that to the hair samples of this unknown primate, then science will tell us exactly what a Sasquatch was. They didn't go extinct. This is what people have been saying for years. On the A&E Bigfoot special, they mentioned that not even 1,000 years ago, when the first Norsemen landed on the East Coast, they were writing about these hair-covered creatures that would come out at night, because they called it doing their work mostly at night. We're stealing salmon from the net. You could always tell when they're around. They had to smell. They're describing a Sasquatch. And the natives along the shoreline, who can't even speak their English their language at the same time, in their folklore, they're writing about the same creature. I find that interesting that not 1,000 years ago, two civilizations in the same area are talking about something that could very well fit the Sasquatch, this hairy, upright, man-like creature. And I find that very compelling.
So you believe it's a creature that hasn't actually gone extinct, coexisting with humanity throughout our history, probably even older than humanity.
Yeah, that's right, because so many descriptions where people have seen them in their headlights. Even police officers in their spotlights have claimed to have seen them at night on patrols. They claim they have this eye glow, this eye shine. I asked the late Grover Krantz, anthropologist from Washington. I asked the current anthropologist from Idaho State University, Jeff Meldrum, has man ever had nocturnal capabilities? Would they have eye shine? And they said there's nothing in the record to substantiate that that ever happened. I put on a monkey suit, my eyes are still human. They don't glow. The Sasquatch, the light hits its eyes, they glow like a coyote, like a bear.
So in addition to their size and their hairiness, there are a number of other features that distinguish Sasquatch from humans. I mean, if we just start at the top and work our way right down the anatomy, they have a cranial capacity, it appears, that would be on par with that of a gorilla or chimpanzee, and is appropriate for the types of behaviors and the lack of an archaeological record for that we see. They seem to be distinguished by an extremely robust chewing apparatus, the masticatory apparatus, which has frequently been a point of divergence between hominid lineages, the gracile versus the robust, referring to the chewing apparatus. The jaws of a Sasquatch are extremely deep, extremely heavily muscled. So we see the suggestion in some descriptions of a peaked head resulting from a sagittal crest, which is simply a buttressing of bone that provides additional surface area for the attachment of very powerful temporalis muscles here. And the large, high cheekbones flaring outward for the attachment of the masseter muscles, the two principal chewing muscles of the masticatory system. Also, along with that, we see a lack of projecting canines, which, would, if we were envisioning a Hollywood monster like King Kong, a giant gorilla-like ape, that's one of the hallmarks of the large hominoids, chimps, gorillas, orangs, is these projecting canines. But these projecting canines then provide sort of an interlocking nature to the jaws, which prevents the side-to-side motion that is usually associated with dentition bearing extremely thickly enameled teeth for heavy chewing, the type of dentition you might expect for a large omnivorous primate in a temperate climate, temperate forest. We work our way down and we come to, well, there's often been the description of a lack of a neck or no visible neck. And that correlates, or that is associated with the very deep jaws. When you have a small brain case coupled with very, very deep jaws, the distance that is traversed by those 7 cervical vertebrae is pretty much covered up by the very deep jaws. So there is a neck, of course there's a neck, but it is obscured anteriorly by the deep jaws and posteriorly by the massive neck muscles that must counterbalance the weight of that heavy, face. Our skull, if I can grab an example here, is balanced quite nicely over this foramen magnum because of our enlarged cranial area for the brain and our reduced face. You know, it's easy. Sometimes my students can master the art of falling asleep, and their head balances quite nicely on that poised on that spine. But for a gorilla or any animal that has much larger jaws, projecting lower face, and not that the Sasquatch necessarily has a projecting face, but the deep jaws are much heavier than this small cranial space for the brain. And so in response to that, to balance the head over the spine, there's this area back here for attachment of neck muscles, neck and shoulder muscles, such as the trapezius. And when you look at, for example, the subject on the Patterson-Gimlin film, this trapezius forms this large, almost cape-like structure that flares out to the broad shoulders. And so from behind, there's very little visible neck. We work our way down, and the Sasquatch, as I said, seems to be very massive. Not only tall, but the mature adults are very, very broad and thick, probably to provide capacity for a large gut, since their diet would consist of a lot of roughage as well as probably meat, in that we think that they're omnivorous. If we look at their hands, one of the distinguishing features, which again correlates well with the lack of stone tools and other material culture, is a relatively non-opposed thumb. A divergent thumb, but one that is not rotated 90 degrees to provide for the precision opposition type of grip, which is critical for not only the manufacture of tools, but the manipulation of fine tools, cutting blades, and so forth. Instead, their thumb faces relatively in the same direction as the other digits, and therefore they lack in their handprints this developed thenar eminence, the musculature that is involved in those movements of opposition, which, when they're atrophied in the human, are termed an ape hand, interestingly enough. Of course, my interest is focused primarily on the feet and the footprints that are left by those feet. And these point to other distinguishing features that set this creature off from the human condition. These footprints are not merely enlarged facsimiles of a human footprint, which is characterized by a distinctive longitudinal arch, which gives that footprint its distinctive hourglass appearance. But instead, they are very flat and flexible. They have retained a degree of midfoot flexibility through the transverse tarsal joint that is a hallmark of the anthropoid ape, the ape grasp climbing adaptation, characterized by a large big toe that diverges from the others and can grasp a vertical support going up, sort of decoupling the prehensile portion from the propulsive portion of the foot. But this is also a useful adaptation for negotiating steep, rugged, broken mountainsides in a temperate coniferous forest. So even with the lack of a strongly divergent big toe, that flexibility then allows for longer grasping digits and for the powerful propulsion provided by the enlarged and elongated heel bone that seems to be characteristic of the Sasquatch foot. So it's an elegant adaptation for a large, heavy, exomorphic bipedal primate that is traveling up and down very steep and rugged mountainous terrain. If we return to the head region, we can look at some of the special senses, and there does seem to be evidence that Sasquatch are nocturnal. They're capable of moving around at night. Now, whether they have night vision, whether they have a reflecting membrane, the tapetum lucidum, in their eye, which would be an unusual sort of reversion to a more primitive primate condition, not out of the question, But it could just simply be a matter of their increased body size with eyes that have scaled isometrically. So all those things together, you know, the Sasquatch really only resembles us in its habit of standing on two legs. Beyond that, it differs from the human condition in almost every aspect.
And then other things that people describe if they've seen one. You know, I've heard people describe that they have a certain smell or odor.
Sure.
I know it's silly, but it's something worth
Oh
noting.
no, it's again perfectly natural. I mean, the same thing applies to other great apes and humans, for that matter. Yes. If we didn't have the you know the hygiene practices that modern Western people employ.
You're looking at, we're about almost 20 kilometers up Harrison Lake, at the 20-mile point actually. That is Long Island out there in the lake, the west side. And if you look up towards, you can see the entrance to the Silver River estuary right there. It's a little obscured by the clouds now, but you would see Mount Breckenridge, which is a dormant volcano here on the lake. And beyond that, Stokey Creek, where that famous incident occurred in the 1970s. Harrison Lake is about 40 miles long. It's about 3 miles wide at its widest point. It's extremely deep. And of course, it's smack dab in the middle of the heart of where the Sasquatch and the Sasquatch legend really was born, and has continued to this day.
Well, there seems to be a very good ecological correlation between credible Sasquatch reports and habitat type and rainfall. If you look at a clinal map showing 18 plus inches of annual precipitation, that pretty much encompasses all of the habitat that we find credible Sasquatch reports. British Columbia has that nature of habitat, moist, wet forests. In fact, the west coast of British Columbia and even inland at the Continental Divide boasts some of the largest temperate rainforests on the continent. And it's my personal opinion that the temperate rainforests were the initial core habitat of this creature. And they have since spread out to occupy much more diverse habitats, much like the black bear. In fact, if you look at the range of distribution of the black bear in North America, it's remarkably similar to what we think is a reasonable range distribution for Sasquatch. But if we look at the habitat across British Columbia, there are vast areas with very little human population that almost certainly harbor Sasquatch.
In the 80s, could researcher Grover Krantz have set the stage for the most credible evidence in regards to this study?
To your right, my left, Grover Krantz, again for our viewers, professor of anthropology at Washington State University, author on this subject. Tell our viewers, what has convinced you that yes, there is a Bigfoot?
Well, the first thing that convinced me was back in 1970 when I saw and studied a pair of footprint casts from up in the northeastern corner of Washington. And this is one we refer to now as cripple foot. The right foot was badly crippled, and I tried to reconstruct the likely bone structure. At the time, I didn't think that was very likely real, but when I reconstructed it, I found out it was exactly the kind of design that would be necessary for an 8-foot-tall creature with an otherwise human body design. And I figured nobody could have figured this out.
And this, you say it's the casts that have convinced you?
Yes, not just that they are cast, but in some of them I can see some details of anatomy that I figured nobody else could have plotted from nothing. And I see them in the footprints, and I figure if somebody faked those, he had to know more about human anatomy than I do, and a more inventive mind than mine, and I don't think there is anybody like that.
Bosberg cripplefoot. It still remains one of the most interesting, I think, one of the most interesting cases. So here's a pair of tracks that were cast in Bosberg, Washington, up near the Canadian border in northeastern Washington state. This foot's quite normal, a normal, healthy Sasquatch, let's put it that way. But this one shows some remarkable pathologies to it. It was either the result of a crushing injury in adulthood, or it could have been a neuropathy, a spinal cord lesion, say, that caused damage down the nerves to the distal features and then cause the soft tissues to pull the foot into a contorted posture. You can see the toes are pushed out of alignment, bent off at odd angles. The third toe's probably just simply pushed up out of alignment with the other toes so that it doesn't leave an imprint. But really telling here are these two bulges on this side. Now, the position of these bulges in a modern human would be way back here on a foot of this length, because we have a disproportionately shorter calcaneus. The greatly elongated calcaneus, for greater leverage, massive weight, corresponding to massive weight of this creature, displaces these landmarks more distally or further down the foot. The possibility, or the probability, let's put it that way, the probability that a hoaxer would stumble on a representation of this pathology, which to an orthopedic surgeon or a podiatrist seems quite natural. For someone to have, in 1972 especially, to have concocted something that was so convincing and to have incorporated this particular pathology in a divergent location, or an anomalous, let's put it that way, an anomalous location vis-a-vis a human foot, but in precisely the right place for it to correspond with the position of that joint in other examples of midfoot flexibility. It just is, it defies imagination.
What is the name of the famous videotape that our viewers are about to see?
Okay, that's sometimes referred to as the Patterson-Gimlin film.
The Patterson film. And I would ask staff there to please roll this, and if you would narrate for our viewers and tell us, what are we about to see? What is this videotape?
There's an animal walking through the forest. This slightly advanced speed. It was
what forest? Where?
In northwestern California, Bluff Creek.
You're talking about the Roger Patterson film of 1967. Documentaries talk about that film all the time, but they terribly misstate the evidence as it happened. They were down there for nearly 3 weeks, as it's been told, and they hadn't found any prints. And one morning, Bob and Roger went up into Bluff Creek where they'd been before. They've been all over the place. They had to say, where are we going to go today? They decided to go up into Bluff Creek, and that's when they rounded that bend up in Bluff Creek on the sandbar. There was a downfall tree. The tree had a root system that was standing there, probably 8, 9 feet high, as Bob describes it. Roger was just ahead of him on his horse. Bob's pulling a pack horse, and he's on his horse, but he's got a much bigger horse. Roger rode a little horse I always tease and say is the size of a Great Dane. Roger was a little guy. So anyway, Roger rounds the bend, and when he does, his horse goes crazy. And Roger notices off by the creek, there's a creature squatted there, covered with hair. He pulls his horse down, tries to control it. He gets off of it, gets his foot hung up in the stirrup, frees himself, and he had his camera in the saddlebag in case they saw tracks. He grabs the camera out, it's one of those old hand-wound cameras, and he takes off running for it and tells Bob to cover him. The creature by then, when Bob come around and had seen it, when all this is going on with Roger's horse, it was standing. What had happened, Roger Patterson had an interest in the Sasquatch for about 7 years or so or more. He'd been out looking for evidence, looking for tracks, gathering reports. And then in the summer of 1967, on Onion Mountain, there were some tracks that had been found. They were building roads at that time up through, making a highway north, up through Bluff Creek and on in up the west coast. So John Green went down to see these tracks. John Green's a local man, lived here. And when he got there, the tracks had pretty much been backbladed and there was only a few left. Well, by the next morning, when John got up very early in the morning, the phone rang. And John says, obviously on a radio phone, the guy called and says, what you're looking for is here. That's all he said. John got a hold of the Sun newspaper in Vancouver. They put up $500 to get pay for a plane and a pilot to fly him down. John got a hold of Dale Moffat, and he brought a tracking dog named White Lady. They all loaded on this small Cessna, and a guy by the name of Keith Shazari was the pilot. Keith, I spoke to about a year ago, and after all these years, you should have heard him. He says that it was amazing the way the dog they put him on the scent of the track where you'll see him just before dark. He said, Bill, he says the hair literally stood up on its back. That dog went into high alert. There was something about those tracks it did not like. There was over 1,000 tracks had been reported there. They counted, I think, 560, 70 tracks that were still left. Other people had been there to see them. Some had run over them, had stepped on them. But these tracks went on for over a mile or so. They went off the road into the bush, up and down a few inclines, through bushwhacking, back out onto the road again. And there were actually 2 sets of tracks that I've seen in the pictures, 15 and 13 inch. They didn't know if they were together, but they did cross paths a few times going back and forth. And then at some point, John Green, who knew Roger Patterson, a lot of the guys knew each other in this little circle. He called Roger Patterson's house when he was in town, and he told him, he left a message with Mrs. Patterson, Patricia, that when you let Roger know there are tracks down here, because at that time Roger's away over at Mount St. Helens with Bob Gimlin on an expedition. There's tracks down here. We know he's wanting to shoot a little amateur documentary of him with a Sasquatch hunter. He was hoping to see some tracks to film. Tell him good tracks, pristine, nice looking tracks. Come on down. It took about 2 or 3 weeks before Gimlin got around to actually being able to leave. Him and Roger took off for Bluff Creek. By the time they got down there, Bob's told me that when we got down there, you could see where the tracks had been, a lot of them, but he says because of the rains and they were in dust and dirt, loose dirt, had kind of washed them out and took a lot of the definition out. You could tell they were footprints, but they weren't really the nice, pristine tracks like John Green had described. A few years ago, we always got people claiming to be involved in this film as a hoax. And it's so disappointing that the news media is willing to welcome somebody claiming a hoax without investigation, without question. And this is what happened when Ray Wallace died. Ray Wallace had a construction company down in Bluff Creek many years ago, and then by the time the Patterson film was shot, he'd moved his operation back to Washington. But yet, every time footprints show up, they wanted to blame, oh, Ray had a pair of wooden carvings here.
If Sasquatch does not exist, as the skeptics and critics would assert, would maintain, then all of the footprint evidence out there has been hoaxed. And of course, we know of one individual whose family claimed that indeed he had hoaxed all of the footprints in the western United States over the years by fabricating these carved wooden feet that were strapped to boots and worn by his brother and cousins and nephews and so forth to traipse around the Pacific Northwest and western United States. Where to begin? What was most dismaying was the speed with which the media grabbed onto this as the explanation. Finally, the mystery was solved. The mystery of Bigfoot had been accounted for by these ridiculously crude and non-anatomical carved wooden feet, with no prerequisite that they account for how these were used, really practically used, in creating not only individual footprints, but long lines of tracks that in some instances were followed by investigators for miles.
So you got Dan Rather with CBS, you got Fox News, you got MSNBC going on. The mystery of Bigfoot has been solved. It was Ray Wallace, according to the Ray Wallace family. Oh, wow. So let's take a look at that. They didn't. So what I did is I got Ray Wallace's carving, and I took, despite the fact that many of these were different lengths than the carving, different widths than the carving, I made them all the same length, I made them all the same width, and I can tell you, a 5-year-old, a beginner, if you'd have just made the comparison, you could see that this wood carving in its toe line could not have made that. But yet, these news channels, Ray never tried to fool anybody, yet skeptics, when you see the tracks along the road, they left this flat appearance, flat, flat, flat. Well, where's the recesses? This is in fine dust and dirt. It left flat tracks. Where green and everybody stepped with their logging boots, their regular shoes, their tennis shoes, you can see the imprint of every sole pattern. This here would have left like a sponge print in that fine dirt. It would not have left a flat, which a pad does when you step all that weight down on it. It would not have been flat. And all of a sudden now they got to think, oh gosh, we were so certain that Ray Wallace made these. The transfer of evidence from this pattern on the bottom of this foot, which they call a stomper, could not have made this track.
The claimant who seems to get the most attention on this point is Bob Hieronymus, who claimed to be the man in the fursuit. The problem with this, the most glaring problem is, as he joined forces with Philip Morris, a famous costume designer, the two apparently didn't confer sufficiently before sharing their stories because they didn't get them straight. They contradict. Bob Hieronymus gave a description of the costume that was diametrically opposed to the description of the costume provided by Philip Morris. Hieronymus describes a costume that was made out of a green horsehide and talked about it being in two principal pieces, one that came over the top, you know, like pajama tops, but without any buttons or enclosures, just a piece that was probably stitched up the back, and a pair of stiff trousers that he wore, of course, and he had football pads, he claimed, and other padding to bulk him out a bit. And then a football helmet that had a fake face built out around it with a single eye opening, because Bob has one glass eye, and they used his spare glass eye in the face of the costume in order to catch the glint of the sun, he claimed. Now imagine walking in this unwieldy costume with a single port of vision, which he claims was a good 2 inches away from his eye. So put a little toilet paper roll up against your eye and then go out there, close the other, and try to walk on an uneven, irregular surface. But if that wasn't enough, then Philip Morris claimed that Roger had simply purchased and then modified one of his off-the-shelf costumes.
And these are the Cyberchrome images, they call them. They're the best images of the film itself. Here you can see the toes on the bottom of the animal. It's in motion. This foot's a little blurred. And here's at the end of the stride, this is one of the things I always point out to people. Notice how the foot is vertical to the ground. Look down here, the foot is hardly off the ground, it's already vertical to the ground. When people walk, and I explain this to folks that come out, even the skeptics, I tell them, listen, when people walk, their feet barely come 15 degrees off the ground. It's like a pendulum. They don't lift their feet vertical, high and vertical. I said, if you want to try doing it, it's hard enough to stand that way. But if you try walking that way, and as far as I know, no one has ever been able to duplicate that. Our bone structure just does not allow it.
When you have a foot that has a longitudinal arch, as in the human, then the entire foot is incorporated into the lever. And that imposes bending stresses on the toes. So the human toes have gotten much shorter. They are there not so much for prehension as for traction. They prevent the foot from slipping back when we're walking and running, and especially the big toe. If we have a foot that has a midfoot flexibility, then when the heel comes up, like this, the weight's not concentrated under the ball of the foot, instead it's under the entire midfoot.
A biomechanical foot, and there's anthropology studies in scientific journals that talk about this. When the foot is in motion, it flexes. There are things that take place, and these toes, for instance, when you go to bend your foot, a Sasquatch has what we call a mid-tarsal break. goes back here, and right in front of it is actually where it bends its foot. You can see it in the film, you see it in the footprints. The ball of the foot was deeper, and of course the toes are always deeper because by then all the weight of the animal has come forward. This part's lifted off the ground, and you got everything, and your toes work like hydraulics. You got muscles and tendons pressing down, and now you've got 800,000 pounds instead of being scattered over the whole foot. You got it on the front of the foot, then you got it on the toes last, and they sink in the deepest of the whole track. Here's a picture of 2005 where me and the watchman at 20 Mile Bay made it up to the top of a mountain that had a growed over switchback on it. And I walked over, and this track was there. Again, the big heel didn't even press here, the ball and the bulbous toes. It even reached a certain depth of dampness because this had water in it, and the air dries it out, but farther down you deep, you get into the moisture. This is my footprint. After I'd filmed it, I'm a pretty big guy, I took my foot for scale and put it right alongside of it. I have pointed heels, people do. Our heels are much narrower than the big rounded heel of a Sasquatch. Many years later, I'm talking to John Green, and he allows me to see some of his pictures from Blue Creek Mountain taken in the summer of 1967. This is the tracks, the 15 and 13-inch track where they crossed each other's paths at one point, and by golly, the heel stepped, the foot cupped, looked like it rolled over onto the ball, and the toes imprinted into the ground right here. And that is exactly what happened in 2005, because I was always bothered why it didn't press the middle. I've seen the mid-tarsal breaks, like you see in the Patterson film, where the foot bends and the large part of the ball of the foot back towards the heel pushes this dirt back, and you get this mound, this ridge across the track, back by the heel. So that's another sign of a real working foot.
I mean, you look at example like, you know, this big male, big heavy male, and look at that. There's no differential pressure there. There's a little bit across this point here, but there's no indication of an arch. It's flat. And that assists in the distribution of weight through more surface area. Given their much greater mass, which is a cube of the linear dimensions, remember, the volume. So the Sasquatch foot walks through a step cycle in a much different manner than we do. Given their long toes, they also, and their shorter legs, they also have a tendency to have a high stepping gait, which is also an advantage when you're walking through rough and irregular terrain. We get trained walking on sidewalks and flat floors to barely lift our foot sufficient to clear our toes on that featureless flat surface. When you go out hiking, you find, you know, you have to adjust a little bit. Or if you're walking down the sidewalk and the two sections of the sidewalk are slightly askew due to frost heave or something, or a root, boom, you know, you can trip over just a 1/4 inch of difference. That's because we're so efficient. We minimize the amount of muscle effort to swing our foot. And in contrast to that, Patty seems to be walking through tall grass, even though she's walking on the sandbar, because her typical substrate that she's walking through is brush and scrub and grass.
So in the film, if you do stabilization of the creature, you can see it had finger movement, it had wrist movement. It bent at the elbows. You put a man in a suit, because the arms are so long, people say, well, maybe he was using sticks to, I think Hieronymus, as somebody suggested this, Bob Hieronymus was the last guy to claim to be in a suit. Possibly he used some sort of sticks or apparatus, even though Hieronymus, in his story, which I don't believe a word of, he said he slipped his hands in the gloves. But the problem is he's 5'10" or so. He's under 6 feet. And when we bend, then our arms have to bend at their elbow. Our wrists have to bend here. In order to get as wide as the back was, like Grover Krantz said once, you'd have to hold your arms up to the side of the elbows to get the shoulder width. Then you got this, so then you got to use some apparatus to swing the arms. But these bend, because you can see in the film, in the original film, people saw it, you could see the muscle movement. It's one thing to try to make a fake suit look like it's got muscles, or even make a muscle look like it moves. But these muscles in the film work off of each other. They fire in a certain sequence when we all walk or we bend our elbows. When we move, everything works in a certain sequence off the other. To make something mechanical that could do all that and mimic perfectly nature, it's ridiculous. It wasn't really available at the time. But then, furthermore, a few years ago, National Geographic, for the first time in history, they did a study where they used science. They used photogrammetry and optic measuring. That's where you can take mathematics, you take the lens that size that Patterson used, you can take known measurements that were taken on the film site, you can take a film frame, and you can tell distances to everything, the size of everything. This animal in its stooped walking posture from the ground, top of its head, leaning forward, deep knee bends, 7 feet 6 inches high. That put all the 6-foot-high guys out of the running as far as I'm concerned. That means standing erect. If it would stand straight up, you could figure at least another 6 inches, put up around 8 feet. They went on to say that only 1 out of 100 million human beings reach the height of 8 feet tall. And those that do have noted abnormalities in their walking gait. This creature walked like it was in its birthday suit. When Roger got behind it and it was walking away up the valley, you could see the space between its legs.
This creature was, had shoulders that were a good 36 inches apart. And the pelvis was as well.
When I wrote my article, Who's Hoaxing Who in the Making of Bigfoot, I showed a guy in an attack dog suit all padded up. He waddled like a penguin because your legs are so bulked, they rub together. You don't have that freedom of motion when you walk. This creature did. 8 feet tall. When you get up over 8 feet tall, you're getting up around the Guinness World Book of Records. And you're talking about people who need apparatuses just to hold themselves and steady as they walk because their muscles are so taxed, their joints, they're usually lock-kneed, the knees are turned in, they have a hard time motoring along. This thing walked away like it was pedaling a bicycle. People look at that film and go, yeah, it walks like a man. But the Russian scientists that looked at it and biomechanics experts in the early 70s when Dahin took it to Russia, when they watched the film, these are the guys that had the Russian Olympic, they were training the Russian Olympians, they realized that this thing walks like somebody who cross-country skis. They said no one walks like that, and they were absolutely right.
The biggest obstacle to the continuing research in this field is the community itself. You've heard it referred to as the Sasquatch community. In the United States, they call it the Bigfoot community. They're their own worst enemy. More than anything, the whole field now resembles more like an asylum that's being taken over by the inmates.
And I want to say something that is different from anything else in this room, okay? We will not find evidence, it is my belief, of Bigfoot, although we will see Bigfoot from time to time. At this precise point in the universe, there are 3 or 4 other Earths functioning at different energy frequencies or dimensions. Bigfoot lives in one of those dimensions. It is a non-violent form of life. It eats plant food, but it does have enemies. Several of the enemies are quite larger than Bigfoot, and then there's little packs like wild dogs. When Bigfoot encounters them, Bigfoot has the capability of changing the energy frequency of its body form. Sometimes, it's like having a rheostat here and dialing. Sometimes he ends up here on planet Earth. And he's here, stabilizes for a short period of time. And then what occurs is he dials himself back and goes back to his other frequency. This is an explanation of why everybody says they see him. But these people over here are saying they never, there is no evidence.
I'm Peter Watts, and I wonder if someone actually killed one and it was in these dimensions, would it just disappear after it died? Or would it stay there?
That is the word that we had. If one died here, they would also move it back.
People going around with spouting all kinds of rubbish and nonsense and taking all kinds of hoaxing and fake footage and fake reports, and getting it all on YouTube and the internet, which has not helped matters at all. And it's put the whole question into the realm of what you would call tabloid research.
Oh my God, straight ahead. Oh, no. See?
Thursday, August 20th, around 9 a.m., Paul says he drove deep into the Blue Mountains of northern Oregon to a place called Deduck Springs in the Umatilla National Forest.
Well, I just drove up to the pond here, and I know they frequent this area in August and September, and I just got out of my little car and walked around over here, and there was tracks here in the mud where I think he was going to get a drink, or I don't know, maybe he was going to cross there or something. But anyway, I must have scared him.
Freeman says he's been searching for the legendary Sasquatch in the woods near the Mill Creek watershed near his Walla Walla home for the last 10 years. In October of 1988, his son Dwayne got snapshots. In April of this year, Paul got video from a distance of around 69 feet. This time, camera in hand, he was a whole lot closer.
I started up the bank there, and I heard brush and stuff popping up there.
Pretty good little track. You sure doing. Went right up this old trail. Run around up there to his mommy, I guess. Yeah, I'm gonna mix up some plaster here. Now I got my cast made. 32 inches between the stride there. I hear the brush popping and stuff. Oh, there he goes. Oh, there he goes.
It looked at me once, and I kind of got a little nervous, and it looked at me, and then it turned and just kept on going, and it went into the brush there and disappeared, and I was looking for it with the camera, and I seen another one, smaller, is coming at me up there.
Oh, God. There's two of them, I guess.
After the incident, Freeman says he heard screams from the direction of the creatures that kept him pinned down for almost 2 hours. Screams he says he did not record.
I ain't never been scared like I was scared yesterday. I never have been afraid of man or beast or anything, but I sat up there yesterday and cowered down like a little kid.
Is Bigfoot fact or fiction?
I really got upset.
This is the first alleged unknown scream, which some people think may have come from a Sasquatch, was recorded by Sergeant Kenny Cooper as he was patrolling in the area of the Chief Mountain Road in Washington State on the eve of November 1975.
Another interesting one happened at Ruby Creek in 1941. It's unique because Jeannie Chapman, who lived on a farm there, again, the road only went up to Ruby Creek, and then beyond a couple miles was her farm. You had to go through the forest or down the railroad tracks. That's the only thing that could take you in that direction was the railroad at that time.
By 1956, there had been several such reported sightings, which had been reported in small local newspapers. Mr. John Green, publisher of a newspaper at Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia, began investigating some of these sightings. Here is John Green to report on a sighting he investigated in 1957.
When I first came here in about 1957, it was still pretty well open. But all this has grown up since then. So what happened at that time was that Mrs. George Chapman, who lived in a house down by the river behind me here, she was in the house and her children were outside. One of them came in and told her that there was a cow coming out of the woods. So she looked out and she saw this man-like thing, but about 8 feet tall and completely covered with hair like a bear. And she knew it to be a Sasquatch. This was, quite a well-known thing to the Indian people. And she was frightened, so she took the children, ran down to the river, and then through the graveyard, which is right behind me here, and came out just about here onto the track, and then ran on down to Ruby Creek. Now, she'd really only had one quick look at the thing, so it wouldn't be that convincing a story, except that a lot of people immediately went back there and saw these enormous tracks. Mr. Tifting, of course, was one of them, and can describe just what the tracks were like and what they did.
Well, he came through the bush into the shed, or the lean-to of the house, and there was a barrel of dried fish or smoked salmon, rather. And he broke the barrel, and there was some fish eaten there and thrown around. And then he went down the riverbank, and apparently took a drink, and then come back up on the other side of the house, through the garden patch, and up to CPR fence, and stepped with 1 foot on that side of the fence and 1 foot on this side of the fence. I can walk right over it. And the footprints was about 18 inches, like. And then he went across there and over to the next fence there and went right up the hillside. And that's as far as we could follow it.
Hi, my name is John Green, and I've been studying Sasquatch since 1957. Custodian at the local high school was named as somebody that investigated a report at a little farther up the railroad. And the Indian lady came looking for her husband, who worked on the section gang, and said that this monster had come out of the woods right when walking towards their house she was in.
You're talking about Mrs. Chapman?
Yes.
Here's a track, and I showed you the one up on the mountain in Miles I found. Here's a track that ended up in Ruby Creek. The same year, Archibald happened in late September. A guy by the name of Mark Corton, and Mark was in Ruby Creek hunting by himself, and as he got down by the bog area where a lot of the game is, geese and ducks are down that way, a lot of water. It says he got near one of the bogs, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, and he turned, and coming down at an angle, a large stone hit the bog right near where he was at. It splashed him through the wall of shrubbery along there. The water was such a splash that it got him wet. He thought he walked up on a hunter's location. He stepped forward and he looked through, apologized or whatever he had on his mind. He looked through, and all he saw was an upright figure walking away through the bush, but he could only see the outline of something dark. He didn't think it was really tall, like it was only maybe 6 feet tall, 6.5 feet tall. Mark's 6'4". But he became unnerved, so he got the heck out of there.
First of all, would you state the full name, please?
First name Mark, last name Corton.
Do you wish your identity to be kept confidential?
No. I don't care.
What is your occupation?
I'm a gas fitter.
Do you wear corrective lenses?
No.
How old are you?
30.
Now, First question is, just tell me generally the story. Tell me what happened.
I was walking down this road up a Ruby Creek, in this marshy area, moving real slow, keeping an eye on the bush, looking for deer and bear. Caught a glimpse of something black out of the corner of my eye moving. No sound at that point, just something moving. So I quickly spun, mainly just my upper body, towards it. Saw a rock 12 to 15 feet off the ground, kind of arcing down towards me. Landed in the bog. Seemed like right next to me, but I don't know where in that bog it landed, but it seemed like it was right there. Mm-hmm. So I paused and started going through the motions in my head, thinking, you know, where could it have come from? And a bunch of things went through my head, but nothing really made any sense. So I backed up a little bit and I was looking at this grove of trees. I saw something black kind of move, and then it took off like a rocket. My first impression, holy shit. And then I started thinking that I had walked through under somebody's tree stand, and he was whipping a rock at me to get me to take off. At first I thought a person threw a rock at me, but then I saw something take off to the bush, and there was no way that was a man.
How did you react when you first saw it?
I froze.
He wanted to go out there and see what the heck threw this rock at him. The rock was about 18 inches long and about it was as tall as half of the length of the rock. And one of the things he told me during the conversation was that the way it was spiraling. I thought I said, spiraling? You mean like throwing a football? Yeah, spiraling like that. It was rotating fast. So quickly I asked him before he could even think, I said, which way was it spinning? And without hesitation, he says, towards me, forward. I said, that's a good answer. He says, why? What difference does that make? Primates can throw underhand. They can't throw overhand. And when you flip something underhand, you start the rotation going forward. A ball or anything, it's rolling forward. I picked up a rock half the size of what he described. I tried throwing it across this narrow logging road. It never got over my head, and I barely got it 7 feet. This thing threw a rock from 40 feet across a bog, and when he turned, he says, just about a foot or two down through those branches, I saw it coming down at a steep angle. So whatever threw it had lobbed it high and threw it towards it, very strong. I said, sure be nice to get that rock. Courtney and his friend never found any tracks. He said, I know the way it went because I could see the bushes move and hear sticks snapping, but I could never see it. It went around the other side, and I know the travel it went around the other side and on out of sight down the side of the hillside. So he goes that way, and they didn't find anything. But when Thomas went in, it wasn't 5 minutes. He says, Bill, bring the camera equipment. So I did. This track here, right here, you can see it through the vegetation where it pressed down. And I don't know if you can see it good enough, but this thing, it actually turned the tips of the toes down when it got into the soft bog, almost as if it's gripping. And that's what it's supposed to do. Remember the foot on Mount Archibald when it was going up the hill? It seemed to be gripping the ground and kept going in the direction of travel. This has 5 toe punctures. They had water standing in them. We waited a day or so to let the water seep out of here because it had been raining the day Mark was there and the day after when I interviewed him. And we let it seep out, and Steenburg actually cast this track, believe it or not. And he has a casting of it at his place. And Mark never knew those tracks was there. And I thought, wow, if this guy wanted to hoax me, he would have made sure that I knew that they found those tracks, come and see them. He never knew. I sent him the pictures. He was so happy that he was able to find evidence to back up his story.
This is my file 10162, which concerns an incident I investigated that happened on September 21st, 2008. Myself and a female researcher by the name of Chrissy found 3 footprints, one of which was cast, and you can see it right in front of you here. It was in bog debris. A footprint in layers and layers of bog debris. And as you can see, that's not the best stuff to try and cast something with. So I was quite pleasantly surprised I managed to get any impression out of it at all. There were 2 other tracks, one of which Miss Chrissy destroyed herself by sinking up to her crotch in mud and falling on it. And the second set was destroyed by a dog, which had clawed it. And the dog was going for this track too when I got a hold of it and told her to tie the damn thing up. So we went back the next day because we thought, because it had been so warm and dry, that it would dry out. And it did. And we cast it at that time because bad weather was due to come back in. We wanted to make sure we got a good casting made before the track was destroyed. But you're looking at the original out of the ground casting right there.
Now, if you want to know the classics, I mentioned the Jacko capture up at Yale. That was very interesting. Thomas Steenburg and myself a few years ago were the first researchers in 125 years that actually found that location by the number 4 tunnel. Everything was like it was in the Daily Colonist article. A train was coming from Lytton, and in those days, a gravel road from Agassiz out to Ruby Creek stopped, and it was all forest, all the way up to Hope, all the way up to Yale. There was no road at that time. So this train was coming from Lytton. It rounded the bend. It says, when the number 4 tunnel first came into sight, we saw something laying by the tracks up ahead. We thought it was someone laying there. It blew its whistle. It didn't move. So they had to eventually stop the train. They dismounted, they went towards it, and when they got up to it, it had come to and it scrambled up the rock bluff. It got up so high, about 10 feet or so, because there are 2 rock ledges possible where they said it happened, that it could have gotten to, and they're about 10 feet high. We didn't know which one, they didn't say in the article, but it got hung up. So they called for the bell rope. They didn't know what this strange creature was. It was covered with hair. They never seen anything like it. The term Sasquatch hadn't been coined until the 1920s, I believe, over here at Chehalis by J.W. Burns. So they got the bell rope, they captured it, they telegraphed into town telling them, hey, the train has stopped, you have to tell them why. In those days, a lot of robbery stuff going on, not to worry, we're a little bit behind. They're bringing this creature in that we captured. So they took it into town, the whole town had heard about this news, it was in a stir. They stopped short of town and dropped it off at the machine shop. They had a doctor named Hannington examine it. In his report, he says that it was 4 feet 7 inches tall, 127 pounds, covered with short black hair all over its body. It had hands and feet, it said paws in parentheses, like a human's, like a man's, but all the fingers ran in the same direction, no opposing thumb like we had. The feet had 5 toes like we have. And it had a short, black, strong hair, it said. And one of the interesting things that the doctor mentioned, from the elbow to the wrist was longer than a man's arm. And they found that it could break a stick by twisting it rather than snapping it like we would have to do. Very strong. What he described was a ape. And I don't think the first gorillas weren't brought over to this continent until around 1902, 1906. So that 25 years earlier, they wouldn't even actually seen gorillas. They would have seen monkeys probably, but not gorillas. Because what you're describing is the size of a chimp or a small gorilla. Those are expensive exotic animals. I said, no one dumps them on logging roads like an old dog you don't want anymore. I said, a Sasquatch is not born big. It comes out as a youngster and it has to grow. They think it got too close to the rock bluff and had fallen and it was just knocked out and knocked the wind out or something. That's how they wound up seeing it by the tracks. They go to take it to England, and somewhere along the line, there's no real trail on it. It ran out. They don't know what exactly happened to it. But in those days, I could only speculate whether you be at sea or on a train. If something dies, you don't leave it laying there, especially if you got a long trip ahead, because they worried about plague and getting sick from a dead body. No way to preserve it. So they probably pitched it overboard, not knowing what it was. And that was unfortunate, because there was that one opportunity that they could have had the body, and they didn't, and they discarded it.
Could Jack Foss's town hall witnesses be liars?
Bigfoot, Sasquatch, abominable snowman, call him or her whatever you want. It's a controversy as old as the hills in which they're sighted, and as fresh as the winds have been blowing the last couple days, because in recent weeks, more sightings The controversy continues. There's a photo sent to us from an alleged sighting, and I believe we have another picture there. Yes, and there we have another picture. Now, let's go from the photographs to the eyewitnesses. I'm going to ask here, who here in this audience has seen Bigfoot? You, sir, identify yourself.
My name's Gary Weiler. I was hunting elk in about 1982 with some family and some friends. It was
Whereabouts?
Up in out of Milton Freewater area, the Blue Mountain Range.
The Blue Mountains.
We were just getting done hunting. It was just starting to get dark. We were camped at the end of a meadow. We were all standing there, and we noticed an object come out of the far into the meadow, came straight at us, and then paralleled us. We figured maybe it saw the fire or something.
How far away?
200 yards. It had just begun to snow. It was plenty light out. We could see it was up on two hind legs walking. We figured it wasn't no bear, because a bear usually does not walk on his hind legs no 100 yards, 150 yards, usually only under attack or something like that. They'll get up on their legs. But it walked through parallel to us to the edge of the woods, and then stopped, fiddled around. I don't know what it was doing, just standing there, and then that was the end of it. We didn't want to go after it.
How big would you say?
Well, to get an idea, at first, when we saw it come out, we thought it was an elk. An elk is a pretty massive animal, you know, and then when we realized it wasn't on four legs, it was up on two, we got a little more curious. We had scopes. We tried to see, you know, better. We couldn't tell no hair color or anything. We knew it was dark, blackish color, and it was rather big, you know, probably 9-10 feet tall.
What was it walking on?
Snow.
Did it leave tracks?
We did not go up there to look. we weren't interested, you know. Like I say, you know, brave white hunters, you know, but we didn't want to go look.
Scientists don't make decisions as to whether things are this or that. They investigate. And I thought, oh, good Lord, I've been trying to get them to investigate for half a century. They don't investigate. They have beliefs, and anything that is contrary to their belief, they won't investigate. So these people have beliefs. They're not scientists.
I'm Grover Krantz. I'm a professor of anthropology here at Washington State University. I teach courses in dealing with physical anthropology, introduction to the subject, human evolution, human races, the human skeleton, and sometimes seminars on advanced subjects.
Do you feel compelled to still make the case for the existence of Bigfoot?
Well, I'm satisfied that this Bigfoot thing exists. Trying to make the case or argue for it on the present evidence is largely futile, but I'd like as much as possible to let the word out as to what I found out and what I'm doing.
Tell me, why is it futile? Could you elaborate on that?
Almost any scientist will tell you in no uncertain terms that you will prove the existence of the Bigfoot or Sasquatch by bringing in a body or a substantial piece of one. No other evidence is proof. They are adamant about this.
Scientific world does not work the same as the legal world. Eyewitness testimony really doesn't mean much. Anecdotal evidence doesn't mean much. Photographic, video evidence doesn't mean much. They need something to physically examine. Basically, you have to lay a Sasquatch out on the table for it. So, unless that happens, this will remain in the elements, for lack of a better term, on the fringe. And for me, what I need to do is I gotta find that hard physical evidence that will confirm to the people who really matter that the Sasquatch does indeed exist. It wouldn't surprise me if the physical remains of a Sasquatch are laid out on a table one day. They won't be found by a researcher like me in the bush. They'll be found by some anthropology student who found them in a long-forgotten museum box or drawer somewhere. It wouldn't surprise me one bit.